Hello again, and welcome once more to a session on the Lam Rim Chenmo. And today we're going to be continuing on chapter 17 of the Insight section of the Lam Rim and volume 3, concerning the object of negation. And before we start, let's do our best to set a motivation and use this time to consider within ourselves how to break through experientially, naturally, and realistically break through our own ignorance. So we're doing this mainly because we recognize that ignorance is the cause of suffering. And through following, for instance, the 12 interdependent links, we can see how suffering leads ignorance regarding the way in which we see things affects our ability to respond meaningfully, and therefore we are prone to error. From this error leads to causes and the actual suffering itself. So we're not just merely concerned with ourselves, we're concerned with everybody, recognizing that everyone is in the same boat as us. We wish to work for the benefit of all. And so to do that, we need to recognize that right now we're not very able to do very much, but we can work on ourselves in our own limited ways, according to our ability. And that's what we are trying to do here. So this is the sixth perfection of the six perfections of the Mahayana tradition. And it is also the third of the three higher trainings found across Buddhism. So the selflessness, which is the aspect that we're particularly working on, is, I would consider to be the core realization of Buddha, which pervaded everything within the Eightfold Path, also in the three higher trainings, and it sees itself right at the center of it, if you like, at the foundational level of the cause of suffering through the 12 interdependent links. So in many ways, what we're talking about in these sessions is very much identifying the center, the center of what it is to be a Buddhist, or what it means to follow the Buddhist path. So last session we concluded a discussion. It was a short session. We concluded this discussion regarding the relationship between insight and dependent origination. And we sort of drafted a checklist of things we need to do in order to break through in terms of the backpack we'll need for our journey to insight. And this session, depending on how much I can do, we'll be looking at how the word conceptuality is used by Chandrakirti and Lama Tsong-kha-pa. And also we will look at avoiding how, if our insight is correct, we are able to avoid mistaken philosophical tenets. And moreover than that, we will develop a firm understanding in Buddha Dharma that doesn't depend upon faith. Blind faith will have an understanding clearly. And then we will look at a definition of the object of negation, what it is, what that self is that we're negating, in terms of saying selflessness. What is it that is not there? And especially then also not only the meaning of the self within insight training, but also how that relates to our training in insight. And I think that would probably be enough. So picking up from the text, it's page 210. Aryadeva's 400 verses says, "Conceptuality sees and you are bound. It should be stopped here." So Rinpoche wants to clarify that the word conceptuality that is being referred to here isn't all conceptual thoughts or any conceptual thoughts whatsoever, but rather those conceptual thoughts that superimpose an essence onto entities. In other words, the conceptual thoughts that are tainted by this ignorance that, for instance, with regarding ourselves, imagines a real me present as a part of that environment. And Rinpoche goes on into quote from Chandrakirti, again on the commentary to the 400 verses by Aryadeva. And it says, a conceptual consciousness incorrectly superimposes a sense of intrinsic existence. So he's saying, look, we've got to be clear. We're not just talking about any conceptual consciousness. We're talking about those conceptual consciousness in which there is this incorrect superimposition. So it's not like conceptuality is the determining, all conceptual thought is colored by ignorance, and therefore we need to destroy all concepts. Rather we need to just eliminate those that have this incorrect, ignorant component to them. So the mistake is afflictive ignorance, which is the root of dependent arising. And Rinpoche is pointing out that some practitioners, having read Aryadeva, have come to the conclusion, or might come to the conclusion, that we must stop all conceptuality, that the threads of reasoning, of insight will, alternatively, that the threads of reasoning that we mentioned before will actually refute all concepts. So so anything that is an object of conceptual consciousness will be destroyed, will be refuted through the process of analysis. And so thoughts like saying this is such and such, this is a mug, where is my blue mug, so on, these sorts of things, he says they will these reasonably benign concepts will be also refuted in terms of the conventional aspect of reality. This would be missing the point. Now, in terms of grasping onto my blue mug, this is what we are working on, but we're doing it because there is this me and my tied to it. So he says, yeah, if we were to think that way, that this refutes all concepts, or it denies the validity of all concepts, then we're missing the point. Made several times earlier already now, that we aren't refuting existence, and we're not refuting convention, but we are only refuting intrinsic existence, and that presumption that there is more to something than its parts. There is something there rather than just its parts on its side alone. Of course we designate or choose to make an entity from our perception or from our conventions, but those designations themselves don't belong to the entity. They're not part of the entity and not on the side of the entity. They're determined and depend upon a designated mind. So that is the distinction to be made between the designation of a cup as a cup, and then also that sort of presumption that's already there on the side of that, or often appears to be there on the side of the mug that we designate, that it somehow is there and we're referring to it as something that already exists, rather than recognizing that the act of the designation brings it into existence on its side. Rinpoche says that if it were otherwise, that we're then that in fact that what we're trying to do was to eliminate either conceptuality or alternatively all concepts through reasoning. Since because we need to train ourselves in insight, there would be no ability for us to apprehend emptiness with a non-conceptual consciousness. So a non-conceptual consciousness that is able to do that is, for instance, one that's developed through concentration, training in concentration, the fifth perfection. So we've got to essentially differentiate between the perfection of concentration and the perfection of insight. Non-conceptual consciousness is available very early on, once we've overcome our coarse levels of concentration. If we are training concentration, we are able to develop a non-conceptual consciousness. Right, but being trained in concentration does not give us access to insight itself, in itself. Right, so therefore, it's like training in concentration is not even specific to Buddhism. It's found in many non-Buddhist Dhamma religions, and also in Hinduism, so therefore, if insight arose from concentration, from non-conceptuality, then all of these yogis, all of these practitioners of concentration would be Buddhist. And in terms that Buddhism is determined by the truth offered through insight. The method branch of Buddhism corresponds to the insight branch, yes, but in terms of two sides of the same coin. So even the aspects of the insight within Buddhism would be reflected in the methods used from merely non-conceptuality, and that's not the case. So non-conceptuality doesn't reflect the methods that we find within Buddhism either. So we know this isn't the case. We know that mere non-conceptuality does not provide insight, because there are many renowned Hindu and other Dhamma tradition yogis who, while having achieved incredibly high levels of concentration, have written and spoken of many ideas such as God, Atma, primordial substance, and other entities that don't survive any way within the perfection of wisdom. So Rinpoche argues that if all conceptual thoughts were contradicted by reason, and this is again looking at the idea that saying that the reason itself is to destroy all conceptual thoughts, then we have basically conflated existent things such as the path, causality, cars, mugs, elephants, with non-existent things, objective existence, true self, created God, primordial essences, and so on. And this is like saying, it is like making the mistake of saying everything is an illusion. When we think this way, we've lost the distinction between what there is and what there is not, and this is an error. In the wisdom text, most of the time, not always, admittedly, not always, this way of talking about things is normally found as a simile. So we'll say everything is like an illusion, everything is like a magician's trick. This happens often enough for us within these texts to recognize that when the like is missing, it is to be understood as a metaphor, not a fact. So it might say everything is an illusion or everything is a magician's trick, but this is actually to be recognized as a metaphor and not as a fact. In other words, it's like an illusion. Yeah. And the conflation of what is with what is not would prevent us from gaining insight. So this is really important to develop some clarity into this. So we need to be able to distinguish, and we've talked about this again in terms of conventional truths and other things, that we need to not make the mistake of being able to not differentiate between those things which are eligible within convention, such as cups, mugs, bends, elephants, and so on, with those things which cannot survive conventional truths, such as gods, selves, souls, and so on. Many different philosophical objects are not available at all, or metaphysical objects that are found in other traditions. And Rinpoche points out that as a consequence, there would be no path to enlightenment, and it would be pointless for us to do any study or reflection. And he cites Aryadeva's 400 verses on this. Seeing what is not emptiness as if it were emptiness, some say, I will achieve nirvana, but they will not. as the Buddhas tell us that you do not reach nirvana through mistaken views. So while you could say this is a general case, in this particular case, Rinpoche is saying we've got to really be clear that we need to recognize how conceptual, saying when Aryadeva says we need to remove conceptuality, he's talking about the conceptuality that is colored by ignorance. So from this, Rinpoche now moves on to discuss how important it is for us to determine the correct object of negation, and how if we miss it, we can end up in a forest of philosophical tenets, which might entertain us for years, it might provide us with academic renown, but it won't assist us in our experience of insight. So this is the main point. The Geluk are often very, very heavily criticized by other Tibetan traditions. The founder of the Geluk tradition within Tibet was Rinpoche, was Lama Tsong-kha-pa. So what we're saying here is that he's saying it's not intellect, but that he was criticized for being intellectual. And he's saying we're not intellectual. We're not even interested in intellectual. We're interested in using reasoning according to the guidance given by these Indians, the great scholars of Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, and so on, to find and experientially find and uproot emptiness. He says, if we miss the point, not recognizing that we are addressing the fictional sort of objective essence, the subtle, implicit, innately present appearance arising due to our ignorance, we end up accepting the objective truths of many things, and these then become objects of discussion, the basis of tenets and philosophical tenets, and these can be found in many, many schools, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist. But if we do succeed in negating the referent, in other words, that which appears to our ignorant mind, we completely stop all of these thoughts. We're free from these reifying or this creation of these various different types of tenet, or believing in or imagining these complex objects. Not only that, but when we read texts by these other schools, it's possible for us to recognize where the hidden assumption may have been made. And it doesn't mean we should stop reading all of these texts, but especially when training in insight, it's better for us to be clear about what to accept and what belongs to the path of insight, and to recognize that the method aspects of some of these great teachers is fantastic. But we need to draw a line under some of the insight areas. So Lam Tsongkhapa, along with the entire Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, depends very strongly on the works of Asanga and also his brother Vasubandhu. So even as far away as Japan, Asanga is known as Mujaku, and his brother Vasubandhu is known as Sesshin. They were incredibly important within the Mahayana tradition, the Mahayana development of Buddhism, sort of 3rd century. Neither of them accepted Nagarjuna, nor did they accept Aryadeva. Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti were born considerably after Asanga. I think normally Nagarjuna is about 1st century or 2nd century. Aryadeva's sort of 3rd century. Asanga and his brother are 4th century. I'm not sure about Buddhapalita, I think 6th century, and then we've got Chandrakirti is 8th or 9th century. So we've got 600 years or so between Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, and Chandrakirti, and Asanga and so on were somewhere towards the beginning of that gap. So Asanga himself is pretty much responsible for establishing and developing and promoting the Yogacarya school, also known as the Chittamarjana mind-only school. which offers an entirely alternative path to insight. Now, within itself, it works. If one follows the Sangha's guidance, one can develop a strong idea of selflessness. But one of the aspects of that is I think is much easier to, especially for a modern person, to stay with Nagarjuna. And for me, that's not just me being sort of faithful to Rinpoche. Nagarjuna, especially the Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Buddhapalita, Chandrakirti lineage in that sense, is really, really still pertinent today. Sangha's text really has this strong distinction between mind and body. And so there's this sort of mind-body dualism, which I think nowadays we would find very, very hard to accept some of the underlying foundational requirements that he used. And this is essentially when Je Rinpoche is talking about having to accept objective truths of some things or other things, he is actually referring implicitly to include a Sangha's Yogacarya view. So while we all accept Sangha as an authority for his depiction of the Mahayana path, and in fact most of the rest of the Lam Rim Chenmo has been written with Sangha's name being Sangha says this, Sangha says this. When it comes to insight tradition, then we put it gently to one side and say, oh, okay, we're going to actually use Nagarjuna Chandrakirti for this. And so we find also this isn't unusual within the Himalayan tradition. The middle way school, the Madhyamaka of Nagarjuna, is generally chosen for its clarity and its lack of complexity. But in the end, of course, it's up to us to decide which school of insight, or whether or not to follow any school of insights, and so on. And even within the Madhyamaka and the various different scholars who follow the Madhyamaka, there is quite a lot of discussion about how or what and how these things should be interpreted. Of course, right? So we still need to say, well, what works for us? What works for us? So yes, as I said, Je Rinpoche chose to stay with the Madhyamaka, and in fact in the very first chapters of the Insight section of the Lamrim, we actually discussed that in some detail. So a claim made by Rinpoche here is that when we get our training insight correct, we will have access to a clear recognition of the underlying truth of Buddha Dharma. And as such, we become free from the burden of philosophical tenets. He emphasizes that we don't remove ignorance by disputing tenets of other traditions. It's not emptiness is not acquired. The object of negation is not acquired. It is innate. We are born with it, and therefore the tenets of other traditions are acquired. We learn them, and so on. And our battle in terms of what we are doing in the perfection of wisdom, in terms of developing insight into selflessness, isn't a philosophical one. It's not having a philosophical debate with other scholars about this and that and the other. Our acts, our weapons for destroying ignorance, are turned within to remove that cursed, furtive, obscuring essence, those sort of essence-tinted glasses from our minds that continually destructively enchant, adding the lie to everything and everyone perceived in a manner that suffices them to be available to us as charming or offensive, and thereby acting as a crude base for our motivations. Initially, we still need to work on moderating our behavior through containing our negativity, containing our negative emotions. But in the end, we need to cut away that rot completely. And we do that. The rot that I'm talking about is that which generates the causes for those negative emotions, those causes of suffering for ourselves and others. And once we're free from that self-centered compulsions, this sort of innate underlying sort of narcissism, or even negative narcissism, self-attention, then we can begin to heal properly. And eventually we do not need anymore to moderate our behavior through restraint, because we no longer suffer those broken motivations that would lead us into mistaken behavior. So Rinpoche says that once we're able to bring rise to this understanding that the referent object of our our innate ignorance is the basic object of negation, then we'll no longer find ourselves lost in intellectual issues or bewildered by the imaginary objects found in various philosophies or mystical statements. And we might choose to focus on the task at hand, which is liberation, right? So this is because if we've developed the altruistic mind of bodhicitta, we'll have entered onto the first of the 5 paths of insight, the path of accumulation. So once we have actually correctly identified the object, which is this the appearance, the referent of that arises due to our ignorance, we can then use reasoning to destroy it. Recognize whether or not we're correctly destroying it, because we know what it is we're trying to destroy. Having destroyed that ignorance, we're then able to see clearly and recognize Buddha Dharma, and we'll see Dharma wherever we look. Whatever we do, a Dharma will appear to us naturally. We will see the truth of Dharma, and we have this thing, in Buddhism where the Dharma is also used to mean thing. And in fact, this becomes available to us as teaching once we have cleared our mind from this ignorance. At that point, our journey to liberation is started. Benefits are that we are no longer, as I said earlier, no longer depend upon blind faith, and as I've said now, Dharma becomes directly available to us. So Rinpoche makes the point that refutation, in other words, this reasoning that we're using, aimed to overturn our experiential self-grasping, not our imaginary or our intellectual self-grasping. Our experiential self-grasping is not an idle pursuit, and it's certainly not easy. As I've said before, we find our mind getting very, very slippery or slippy when we start shining a line onto the dark recesses of our innate convictions. Everything else becomes more attractive as an activity. Yeah. So we're like, oh, let's really work on meditating on finding that an innate self-awareness or sort of conviction of self, and then use reasoning, the 4 or 5 strands of reasoning. And all sorts of things will come in saying, oh no, I've got to do this. Or, oh, what about that? And it's like essentially very similar to, like, we might not normally find pleasure in doing the washing up. And then somebody reminds us, or we remember that we have to fill in a tax return, and suddenly the washing up becomes really, really sort of attractive to us. Now, it might be the other way around for you. You might love doing tax returns, and not, but the point is essentially, you understand the point I'm making here, which is that this is something that we find very, very uncomfortable to do this work, to go in and actually look at this. So Rinpoche has now given us, defines for us a concise definition of the object of negation in insight training, which is, it's the referent object of our innate ignorance. So that is, in terms of just breaking that down a little bit, it's what our innate, we're born with it, ignorance adds to our mind, which just isn't there. It's not acquired as we grow, it's built in from birth. Referent means it's the thing being pointed to, not the word, but the thing that we imagine. So all the other terms that we find, such as inherent, intrinsic, essential, These merely help to describe the object of negation by referring to the qualities that our ignorance gives to it. For example, when we see a mug in the shop and we don't think, oh, look, there's an inherently existent mug in this intrinsically existent shop. We just don't think that way. But we might think, whoa, wow, I'm going to buy that lovely mug. And this shop is amazing, right? So there's this like implicit sense of attraction, that the idea that this mug is somehow going to give us joy and this shop is here to provide us with some sort of joy. So we created this efficacy, this ability for the mug to be an object of that will bring us joy. Or we might think, ew, who would buy that hideous mug? This shop is filled with rubbish. So it's exactly the same sort of thing. It's using the same sort of mind, which is creating efficacious objects which provide us either, or seem to provide us with a great amount of pleasure or repulsion or whatever. Or we could say, you know, indifference as well. It's like, nothing here for me. This shop's just bland. It's just vanilla. We're still, it's not, although our emotions are not strong, they're indifferent, we're still this shop, that shop, this mug, that mug. So that sense of clunking it all together, right? That's what we're looking for. We don't go around thinking, oh, well, this is inherent, right? So this mind is like, we need to be clear what is specifically the aspect of our response to our experiences, which is revealing this mistake, this ignorance. So Rinpoche again rephrases, we learn to recognize that all beings are bound in samsara, but minds that have this this object of negation as its object, right? The object of negation being the appearance, the referent of this ignorance, of the ignorance that binds us to samsara. We use our reasoning to shine a light on that object of negation, demonstrating that it has to be and cannot be anything other than a total fabrication and complete fiction. Doing so loosens the basis of our afflictive mind. The mind afflictive just means causes us suffering, causes others suffering, and begins to free us from misery. So we repeat this regularly, working at and developing a deeper, more serene clarity with it, understand it more and more clearly, recognize it in more and more contexts, and eventually we are shaken free, we are shook free from the afflictions, and later on liberated completely. So this ignorance that binds us to cyclic existence is not acquired through tenets. Again, it's otherwise, you know, this idea that somehow it's that all we're doing is arguing philosophically is not the point. In fact, it's really important in terms of the way in which we can read academic translations and of the texts by Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna, and the commentaries will say, oh, this is this is a response to the Chittamatra, the Yogacarya. This is a response to such and such. I said this even myself earlier on, that Rinpoche is referring to the Yogacarya. But much more important is that if the Yogacarya, these great Buddhist minds, can have these thoughts, so can we. And it's that point that we need to be aware of. It's not about whether or not he's referring to Yogacarya. He's referring to us developing that sort of Yogacarya mind. So we've got to work on our own convictions that arise and so on, or these ideas that might come of these sort of philosophies that might arise from our insight training. And the point is to say we've got to really carve them off and work, stay on track, work on our own problem, our own ignorance, our own experience of that ignorance. So yeah, if it were philosophical tenets that that bound us to cyclic existence, then only philosophers would would suffer, and we know this is not what Buddha teaches. So we can't achieve insight through either through philosophizing or through intellectual pursuits, right? It's not an intellectual game. We're here really to work on experiential, being humble, looking at our own faults and flaws within us and working on those. So, yeah, sure, developing reasoning or learning the skills of debate are very, very powerful for honing our ability in terms of developing critical thinking, working on understanding reasoning very clearly. And this is a very useful tool in our backpack for insight. But experiential insight, it requires us to look within, examine within, go to those places that we don't want to look into. We don't want to look at them, and scrutinize our own perceptions, our own assumptions, and find and kick out that weevil mind that maybe a weevil is wrong, because weevils maybe are very nice, but some sort of nasty little component of this mind that hungers for all of our attention, that we imagine to be there, hungering for our attention, creating a reason for us to waste our times on self-attention. So having concluded that in the path of insight, the objects of negation are the experiential, referent objects of our innate ignorance, right? There are both the completely imaginary personal self that our minds are transfixed by, around which the universe seems to revolve, and also a destructive fascination that imagines that the entities within our universe are in themselves causes of joy or sorrow, rather than recognizing that entities are merely designations just as we are. It's easy, really, when we've developed our understanding in these strands of reasoning, to be able to see clearly that objects are merely designated, transitory, arbitrary collections that are completely dependent upon manifold causes and conditions, that being only a designation on a continuum. So there's this thing, again, within Buddhist insight tradition, where we talk about saying plantain tree, but a banana tree is the same as plantain tree. So a banana tree, it's like we imagine within ourselves and within the things that we see around us that there's some sort of wood, right? Some sort of substance there that's of value to us, and is a bit like imagining there's wood within the core of a banana tree. So there's somehow, if you see a banana tree, you see these leaves on the outside, very, very tightly wrapped around the trunk, or the apparent trunk is even called in botany, it's called a pseudostem. So there's like this trunk of tightly wrapped leaves, which appear like a bit like bark. They're very fibrous, they're very, very tightly put together. But in fact, if you peel away these leaves, you find underneath more leaves, right? And even though these trees grow to 20 meters high, if we unpack them, all we find is leaves. It's like a huge, great big long leek, like the vegetable, not a hole in a pipe. So this, a vegetable leek, like in Wales, we eat leeks. So this idea is essentially banana tree. The trunk of a banana tree is like a leek. It's just leaves. So we imagine, however, this is like the idea that behind these leaves that contain us or seem to contain us, really there's this valuable wood. But in fact, there's just leaves. There's no valuable wood there at all. So this experiential but imaginary construct that arises from our innate ignorance, that substantiates ourselves and makes things appear to be there by themselves, is a hidden assumption that we are born with. This innate ignorance is the first of the 12 links of dependent arising, as we discussed for 2 sessions. The words we learn and use to identify this ignorance and how it appears are themselves acquired, right, such as intrinsic or inherent, and are merely superimpositions based upon that. But much of metaphysics, considering how the world really is, are likewise acquired, and many of them themselves rest upon this underlying hidden assumption arising from ignorance. So we've got to really be clear about identifying this ignorance and eliminating it. Otherwise, we're going to be creating all sorts of issues for ourselves. So as we've discussed for so many sessions now, right, the reasoning is in the path of insight works by demonstrating that the constructs arising from this ignorance are completely imaginary. When we see that there's no wood under the surface of the banana tree, we stop looking for that wood. When we see that the snake is only a hose pipe, we no longer fear its venomous bite. But reasoning doesn't directly affect our sense perceptions. So we might visually still see the snake in the hose pipe, even after we recognize it's just a hose pipe. There are plenty of non-conceptual thoughts, such as these sense perceptions, which are not going to be directly affected by our reasoning, by our development of insight. Similarly, there are many conceptual processes which are completely unaffected by the reasoning because they don't involve the clunky behavior that our ignorance gives there. So I feel, although Rinpoche doesn't mention it, he mentions it elsewhere in a different context, but I feel that the plasticity of our mind and the ability that we have to adjust to new ideas, and that affects, pervades our entire interactions with the world, eventually allows even the sense perceptions to accommodate and respond to our realizations. And this is obviously repeated through becoming accustomed to and meditating on insight and training ourselves in insight, especially off the meditation cushion, where we bring that the meditation, our understanding from our meditation into the world and into our interactions. So there's a question Rinpoche either puts forward or one of his students makes, which is, how is it that ignorance superimposes intrinsic nature? So while Rinpoche has discussed in much detail the relationship between ignorance and our experience of an intrinsic nature, he also points out how many words used in the Madhyamaka tradition need to be understood in context. For instance, the word nature and essence are used for normal conventional discussions, and are used in conventional context by the masters such as Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. And when they are used that way, they don't have any privileged meaning at all. They're just used as normal words. For instance, if we say this thought is essential for understanding the Dharma, doesn't imply that the essentiality of that thought is somehow some sort of essential existence. So we've got to recognize the context of how we use these things. And likewise, the word nature has many different meanings within Buddhist Sanskrit. I think there's a book by McGee on all the different ways in which it's used, and some of them appear to conflict. Sometimes we use the word ignorance naturally arises, and we also talk about the natural state of emptiness, such as in tathata. So this sort of thing here is, we can see it being used in 2 different ways. So identifying the context when we're learning, developing our understanding of insight is very, very important for us to note if we want to determine the intended meaning. So Rinpoche says, look, I'm trying again to put these words to one side. He says, given the context of the ignorance that binds us to samsara, however, there arises in our mind, given regardless of if the referent, what it is that we're considering is ourselves or the person or other entities outside ourselves, there is a sort of underlying assumption that the entities have a way of existing in themselves or by themselves, independent of the awareness that is recognized, in other words, our perceptions of them in that moment. We might recognize that the mug is merely a transitory continuum of motile components. We might recognize that the way we see the mug is richly layered by prior experience, culture, language, convention. We might recognize the mug depends upon many different causes, conditions, and circumstances, both for it to arise and also for it just to remain. Yet we still invent this sort of unitary external thing for all of those thoughts to hang upon. We quite compulsively impose this external thing that's somehow greater than the sum of its parts, that gives it its existence. And it's that aspect there which we need to be very aware of, that while we are doing this, it's that unitariness thing that we're trying to use this reasoning to eliminate. And Arya Deva's 400 verses, again Rinpoche cites, says, all of this is without its own power, therefore there is no self. In other words, this depends completely upon this mug and all entities, depends completely upon our designation, completely upon the fact that we designate it as being a thing, and we presume that we are, again, that the thing is there for us to address or for us to consider, and we've already we've already put something there for us to have that discussion. So going back to, for instance, ourselves and the self, the nature of self, I'm going to put the text to the side for a moment and explore a thought experiment that arose from a conversation a few years ago. Now, personally, I find this very helpful and enough to share it. And it comes in two parts. So it's nothing that we won't be revisiting anyway in subsequent chapters, but I think it would be nice to sort of see a little bit, maybe this might help. So imagine that you are invited to and presented to some science hall, and you're presented with a teleportation device. So it's like a closed telephone booth. You're told how it works, right? There's a set of powerful lasers which digitally record every single particle and energy level of your body while destroying you completely. It happens in microseconds, so there's no pain. And then the data is sent via the internet to a reconstruction box, the other side of the world or wherever, or next door even, where your body is reconstructed just as quickly. All the memories are intact, all the body functions are just the same, but the box has destroyed you entirely, killing you, albeit in a controlled manner, allowing for the reconstruction process to take place. And the reconstruction appears to be a near-perfect replica of you, such that your memories and so on, and your experiences and your health are all the same, right? And the data capture is complete. It could be stored for decades before being used for reconstructing you. You would have no sense of time. It would have been, I've just walked into the box, right? Or even possibly it could be sent to multiple reconstruction boxes. So then there would be several of you all thinking I've just walked into the box, but that's sort of slightly outside of the context. The reason why I mention this is just to be clear that there's nothing about you at all that is left at the destruction. There's nothing left at all. So the question I ask is, would I use that box, knowing that whoever comes out is a mere replica of me, albeit almost indistinguishable from the person who entered? Well, fingerprints, everything like that is the same, hasn't changed. All right, so there's just maybe a very, very subtle amount of change happened. So within that, would I use that box, knowing that I've been destroyed, that this has come to an end, and that a replica has been produced at the other end? So it's worth considering, not just intellectually as a sort of a game, but also at a personal, emotional level. How do I feel about the idea of walking into a box where I am killed and a replica of myself is produced somewhere else? So would I honestly enter that box, knowing that it would kill me? Regardless of if a near perfect replica who has all my memories walks out of the other side. So we should think this carefully, taking note of our response. So that's the first half of this sort of thought experiment. The second half is to consider, actually, that box already happens to us every single moment. It's called time. Every moment, a near perfect copy of a person arises from the person of the prior moment. Our continual momentary death and reconstruction is requisite for any sense of life. Stasis offers no experience whatsoever. So our sense of continuation or continued existence is merely a deep-rooted conceptual imposition that imposes an entity upon the continuum of unceasing flow of cause and effect. So we imagine somehow this flow is greater than the sum of its parts. We imagine that I persist across it, right? So the entities also that captivate us, both living and non-living, have, by the time we perceive them, have also ceased to exist. Our senses are always playing catch-up on the past for anything that we are perceiving. So any relationship we have with these is actually based on a fantasy, because all we're looking at is an echo of what was a few milliseconds ago. How is it then we fear death? Right? Indeed, fear anything if we recognize that each moment brings its own death anyway, right? So this is an exercise to think about. It might not work for you. Some people, well, of course I won't. I'll go into the box. There's nothing there. But for when we get there, there's a part of us like, do I really want to try that? Do I really want to do that? That resistance we can see, is because we aren't convinced yet that we are merely an aggregate, a designation imposed upon a continuum. So this aspect there is a way of being able to see a little bit like, oh, I want to hold on to this. So there's Lama Tsongkhapa, when he was teaching insight to his students, one of his senior students, when he was, I think he was probably teaching Lamrim, and he was talking about how this sense of self is really not present, and he's a very good teacher, unlike me. One of his students grabbed himself like this, and Rinpoche said, "Oh, you've got it now. You understand." Yeah. So the reasoning of this idea, the teleportation machine, is all based upon the same sort of reasoning. We're still looking at impermanence. We're looking at composition. We're looking at dependent arising, and we're looking at how essentially the dependent arising is the engine of existence. It's the engine of the causal flow of cause and effect, right? So Chandrakirti, in his commentary on Ayurveda Devas 400, says that the self we imagine is, and again we're talking about how we experience this, it is that which exists essentially, intrinsically, autonomously, and without depending upon another. So he's saying that these are all synonyms for the way in which we experientially see ourselves. Rinpoche qualifies. He says, when we're talking about without depending on another, even though we've spent a lot of time talking about dependent origination, in this particular case, it does not mean dependent upon causes and conditions. But instead, it means another means not dependent upon a consciousness that posits or places it as being there. In other words, the designation. So we imagine that the set of components or the bundle of aggregates exists as an independent unitary object, even when the object is not designated. So we imagine that the mug is here, even though even while it's not being designated as a mug, while we're not experiencing it as a mug, that it continues. However, it's not like I'm saying it ceases to exist. It's not as if it all vanishes, right? The causal flow of effect, interdependent arising, still continues. So the tree does make a sound when it falls in the forest, even if there's no one to hear it. But the composite tree, the composite forest, the composite sound, the composite no one, I guess, are mere designations, and we place those in order to communicate about aspects of the we have defined regarding or in light of the ever-changing flow, the great multidimensional river of causes and effects that completely pervades us and everything we ever experience. So recognizing that we are embedded within this ocean of causes and effects, right, gives us a little bit of an idea about how we are, we compose, designate, label, and respond to the objects that we designate as if they are substantial, independent, autonomous, working on their own, but merely they're just a part of this great ocean. The ocean itself is merely a designation, right? So also in light of Chandra Curtis' comment, Rinpoche says that the word autonomous here refers to our superimposition of it naturally existing on its own side upon the entities that we designate or that we perceive. So this is what is meant by essence in the Madhyamaka. So when we talk about essence, essence has many different meanings. It has many philosophical meanings in Western philosophy. What we're talking about is this this self, the self that we imagine, which exists essentially intrinsically, autonomously, and without depending upon another. So this is the meaning of essence or intrinsic nature, that it naturally exists on its own side, independent of our perception or our designation. So Rinpoche asks us again to consider that pesky snake in our garden, the one which we superimposed upon our hose pipe, right? If we consider how that snake appears to be present in terms of its own nature, or if we consider the defining attributes or qualities of that snake, what are we doing, right? It's like the snake just very simply doesn't exist. It's not present. We can't make sense of defining its attributes or its qualities or its features. So he points out it's the same with all the entities, all the entities that we imagine, ourselves and those beyond us, right? Putting aside the mechanism of how they appear to us, if we ask ourselves, what is the manner of being, the being of myself? How does this mug actually exist? We've dragged our preconceptions into the question because we've established the mug and then asked, well, how does it exist? And we've entered into philosophy. So the entity itself cannot support our analyses because it simply isn't there in that way in the first place. We're needlessly wondering about the nature of the snake rather than recognizing the snake just simply isn't there. Yet our ignorance does that. We imagine things can be understood how they are, and that it is the objects themselves that have power over us, that are responsible for our experiences of them. we don't, we relate to the objects as being things there, not just a part of the causal flow that interpenetrates them, right? So we build these relationships with these things as being things that are sort of static, unitary, unchanging, even though we know very well they are not like that. So the mere designation, the conventional objects that we assertions that we make about saying, "Where's my cup? Oh, it's over there." This is fine. There's no problem with that. It's my cup. I love that cup. It gives me so much pleasure. We're beginning to see an aspect of that where there's a lack of awareness or some sort of presumption about the nature of what it is that it's able to deliver for us. And we talk about the referent objects, even though they are merely designations, they're merely imputed by our mind as being somehow efficacious. We say, that bee stung me, right? We perceive an independent entity that deliberately chose to attack us. And from that perception, we can generate an entire raft of emotions and narratives that affect us. So Chandrakirti, in his commentary on Ayadeva's 400 verses, says, indicating the meaning of the word essence for insight meditation and how this essence does not exist. Don't doubt that which exists only through the presence of our conceptual ignorance and does not exist without that conceptual ignorance, definitely does not exist, essentially, as in the case of the snake in the hosepipe. So this essence, how an entity appears to exist by its own nature, on its own side, independent of it being placed there through the power of perception, this is the self, which is denied in the teaching or the teaching of selflessness. So the path to selflessness. So when we've got to be clear that it's very easy for us when we're reading selflessness, we imagine it's talking about a self of persons, but it's really talking about essence, this appearing to exist on its own, by its own nature. So the absence of this essence, when applied to a person, is known as the selflessness of the person, and in the absence of other entities is known as the selflessness of objects. So while the division might seem arbitrary, as the absence is the same, it's the selflessness of the person, which, especially when it is ourself, which is the primary cause of our problems. So this is also known as the conception of the two selves, one of persons, one of objects. So Rinpoche, having said this, says, well, let's. I'm only following Chandrakirti, who's commenting on Ayadeva's 400 verses. He says, self is an essence of things that do not depend upon others. It's a nature inseparable from that thing. The non-existence of that essence is selflessness, the core teaching of Buddhism, right? Because of the division of persons and objects, it is understood as twofold, the selflessness of persons and the selflessness of objects. So one of the potential ways in which, one of the questions that is asked, which I find a little bit subtle, and is essentially that whether or not the selflessness of persons includes other people, and whether or not the perception, when we see somebody else, whether or not they belong to the selflessness of persons or selflessness of objects or entities. So especially as Chandrakirti has talked about persons in general, it sort of becomes a little bit unclear as to whether or not we are talking about just the self, personal self. And Rinpoche says we should consider the apparently essential nature of people other than ourselves to be included in the selflessness of persons. He says that when we're talking about the personal self, we use this Madhyamaka term, which we visited before, called the reifying view of the perishing aggregates. And he says we can distinguish slightly between the reifying view of the of this and the selflessness of persons as follows. But first of all, he says, let's be clear that the reifying view of perishing aggregates, without qualifying it as being innate, it also includes all of the acquired philosophical views too. So we want to put that to one side. So we're really only concerning ourselves at this point with the innate view of the perishing aggregates. And just to be clear, it's not the aggregates, in other words, the composition that is the object of negation. It is the idea that there's something there beyond merely the collection. It's the idea that there is something more than the sum of the parts, right? And on its side, so we can create we designate a sum of the parts. There we say there's a set, there's a person, and there's that. But it's more than that. There's actually something on its side, and not the designation. So something on its side, not on the subjective side, and that is the object of negation. So Chandrakirti's explanation on the middle way says regarding the innate view of the perishing aggregates, or the innate reifying view of the perishing aggregates, it says the view of the perishing aggregates that operates within the thoughts of I and mine. So the innate view of the perishing aggregates concerns the person, and by definition, the person in this case is the basis of I or me and our own personal self. And therefore, when we focus on eliminating this personal self, we don't use the selfness of persons, or of other persons, as the basis of our meditation. We need to work within ourselves. So we've got to work, first of all, on eliminating this fictional, impossible, but innately appearing imaginary friend we call me, as this completely dominates our perceptions and acts as the apparent, truly existent subject of our actions and experiences. And it's basically how the entity, this sort of fictional entity around which our universe entirely revolves. So it's not good enough in a sense, Rinpoche says it's not really good enough for us to be merely existent by way of an essence in terms of what it is that we're refuting or eliminating through our analysis, or of intrinsic nature. It has to be that sense of sort of true self, the me that we imagine as appearing not to be imaginary, and being more than merely a convention or a designation. It's that what is present right here, right now, listening to this stuff. Yeah, that mindset. I'm right here, right now, listening to this stuff Ben's going on about. That me there. So again, Chandrakirti's explanation of the middle way goes on to say it's the view of the perishing aggregates that's to be eliminated, and it's eliminated on understanding the selflessness of self. So the self here, the last word is being used in a conventional sense. It's the selflessness of the self in terms of it's the superimposed ignorance that we give to the merely conventional self that we're needing to eliminate. And Rinpoche also qualifies this. He says we can identify this view of me as it is contradicted by applying the reasoning that demonstrates selflessness. So we can recognize aspects of the conventional self as being distinct from the object of our analysis, because the conventional self is not damaged by our analysis in any way whatsoever. We talked about this several sessions ago. So even though the conventional self, I, Ben, Cup, are all used in communication, used in understanding, and used in reasoning, are very, very important. They are mere designations. They do not reify. They do not generate a reason for us to imagine that these things exist in their own way, on their own side. So it's this ghost in the machine when we're talking, especially with a look at ourselves, there's a machine here, right? The body and blood and brain and energies and so on, right? Those that are destroyed by a laser beam, and there's something else, the spirit, the ghost. This is what isn't there. So this compelling experience, this experiential sense of being, as an autonomous, solitary, solid, persistent manner, is very, very much affected by our analysis. We see, we believe we persist through time, right? You know, we do. And it's that thing there that we are actually saying, no, we don't. So while we can use, and again, we need to use these methods to help to identify the object we need to eliminate in terms of the boundaries of its existence, we can also prod it with a stick, metaphorically, so, and see, oh, and it's like, oh yeah, there it is. Yeah. So we can look at, also we can see it arising in terms of our relationship with those things that we consider to be ours, especially when our sense of ownership is being threatened, like, hey, that's my ice cream, get off. Right at that moment, we can see it very clearly. So even when there is no strong sense or any sense of I or my in terms of objects or others and so on, the mistaken concepts of the person are still a case of ignorance. They're still afflictive. They're still a cause of suffering. But we can also imagine that essentially some of those mistaken views could be non-innate, they can be acquired, and in that sense they would rather belong to wrong view rather than afflictive consciousness. And then Rinpoche also mentions in terms of method, as he mentioned earlier on, that regarding the snake, the sense of this sense of self that we have, we don't try to reason directly against the mistaken view of me, which irrationally arises from our ignorance. Instead, we reason against the supporting assumptions that give that fiction any possibility at all of existing, and when it has none at all. And when we demonstrate that it cannot be persistent, cannot be solitary, cannot be autonomous, cannot be separate from our mere something more than our mere designation, cannot be efficacious, and therefore it can only be a convention, a label, designation. Anything else that appears to be or have is a mere fabrication. So this is how we do it. Okay, so I think I'll stop this time. And next session will be the last session of this chapter, and we'll be looking at how qualifications are used both in our meditation and also in texts, qualifications such as essentially or ultimately, and when we should or should not or can or may use them or find them within the Majjhimaka. So after that, let's dedicate any benefits from the session to uncovering, exposing our ignorance, and defeating it completely, eradicating it from ourselves such that we may become liberated. And as a liberated being, we may benefit all beings and help them uncover the causes of their suffering and help them to, or show them how to destroy the causes of their suffering. Okay. So now let's just sit for a minute and see you next session.